Now, to update the user, we should send a request to the endpoint that represents an individual user, like users/1. So we send a request to this endpoint and include a user object in the body of the request. So back to our project. In this ID folder, let's open this route file. Earlier, we exported a function for getting a single user. Now we're going to export a function for updating it. Now here we have two options. We can use put or patch. What is the difference? Well, a lot of people use these interchangeably, but technically speaking, we should use put for replacing an object and patch for updating one or more properties. In this case, I'm going to go with put. Now we give it a request parameter of type next request. Now here we should also access the route parameter. So I'm going to borrow this code from the get function. Okay. Now let me reformat the code so you can see things clearly. So we have two parameters here. One is the request object. The other is the object that contains our route parameters. Now, in this function, in a real application, there are a few things we need to do. First, we should validate the request body. If the request body is invalid, we return a 400 error, meaning bad request. Otherwise, we should fetch the user with the given ID. Now, if this user doesn't exist in our database, if it doesn't exist, we return a 404 error, meaning not found. Otherwise, we update the user in database and return the updated user. Okay, so let's implement this step by step. First, we need to read the request body and validate it. So here we call request.json. Just like before, we await it and make this function async. Here we get the body. Now we check. If body.name is falsy, we return next response.json. Here we add an error and say invalid request, or we can say name is required. That's more specific. Then we pass the status, which is 400. Bad request. Okay. So that was the first two steps. Otherwise, if the user is valid, we're going to fetch the user. If the user doesn't exist, we return a 404. So let me simulate this scenario by saying if params.id is greater than 10, we return a different kind of response. Here we set the error to user not found and status to 404. Otherwise, we update the user in database and return the updated user. So for that, we're going to return next response.json. Here I'm going to hardcode the ID of 1, and I'm going to set the name to body.name. That is the skeleton of this route handler. Okay. Now let's test this. So back in Postman, let's send a put request to users/1. Now we should include a user object in the body of the request. So let's send the request. Now we get a 200 response, and here's the updated user. Beautiful. But if we pass an empty string for the name, we get a 400 response, meaning bad request, saying name is required. Now, what if we use a valid name, but try to update an invalid user? In that case, we get a 404 error saying user not found.